Hello there, this is the voice of Stewart Pearce, and welcome to Deep Dialogues, a series of 12 remarkable conversations that I'm having with male soul stewards from all over the world, these extraordinary men who are transmitting unconditional love, empathy, and vast waves of spiritual intelligence, encouraging us, inspiring us, enthusing us into living a new level of living, and thereby creating a brave new world. So, ladies and gentlemen, we have the wonderful William Bloom sitting with us. And I'm so grateful for William, because William is a really mature reference to all of the extraordinary developments that have taken place within the mind-body-spirit community, or the human potential movement, over the last 35, 40 years. And so, William, welcome and thank you for being here. If I may, I'd just like to officially introduce you by sharing with everybody your illustrious journey in the sense of your bio. So William lived off-grid in the high Atlas Mountains of southern Morocco for 2 years, discovering what a contemplation of the divine would bring forth. And then as a mature student, went to study at the London School of Economics, where he gained his doctorate in political psychology, and then furthermore went on to publish Personal Identity, National Identity, and International Politics via Cambridge University Press. He then moved to work with special needs adults and teenagers at Southwark College, gaining a Cert Ed. William's studies into the substance and essence of consciousness also included 3 years of psychoanalysis with Dr. Edward Glover, with an immersion into the psychotherapeutic and complementary healing practices, including bodywork, breathwork, indigenous and pagan cultures, and of course, meditation, being offered in his whole extraordinary process since the early 80s. Now, William has published a number of extraordinary books that I'm going to be referring to, because would you consider yourself to be an intellectual, an academic, or a sentient being?
A sentient being.
He thinks really clearly, ladies and gentlemen, but he's a wonderful sensitive. So I'm going to mention your wonderful book about psychic protection, and of course the forgive me, the title, I have it written down here, about nature spirits and angels. Yes, being in touch with angels, fairies, and nature spirits. I couldn't resist, because being an angel person myself. Anyway, so this is William, and William, of course, William and I, as it were, met. Not informally, but officially, when he was co-founder and director of Alternatives, which, as you all know, those of you in London, is the home of the human potential movement, or the mind-body-spirit movement, and is a very significant mouthpiece, I guess, and earpiece for all things to do with the spiritual teachings of contemporary philosophy. So, and also many, 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 many wishes to all of the wonderful people who are coming in from Los Angeles and around the world. So, dear William, your spiritual odyssey has been extraordinary. Where did it all begin?
Ooh, how many thousands of years back shall I go? Serious question, where did it all begin? It began with 2 incidents when I was really little, actually. One is I'm about probably 4 years old, and I watched a little girl who had thick pebble glasses, very thick lenses, and curly hair, and I watched her being bullied at my pre-primary school, and something awoke in me just immediately that just said, not fair, not right. There's another way of doing life. So it was a basic arousal of social justice and compassion, I suppose, just a deep instinct. And that's probably been the strongest dynamic running through my life. And the other dynamic that threads with it, again, from very early on, and I think many children have it, was, I remember, because I was brought up in Earls Court, South Kensington. We had a little garden square next to Earl's Court Underground Station. And I remember, again, 4 or 5, sitting in the garden there, in the middle of this blocks of flats, looking at the blue of the sky and going, oh, that's probably the blue of God's eye. And I don't understand why people go to church when it's obvious that the real church is right here, right? And so I did a kind of direct connection with spirit. And so those 2 threads weave through me: social justice, compassion, and connection with the wonder and energy of life. And in the middle of all that, like the rest of us, I'm a neurotic, challenging human being trying to sort myself out and become more loving and conscious. And that's my life.
Yes, and I, with great relativity, I can share with that, because although we appear to be highly accomplished in the records of the world, the point is that we're human beings going through a very ordinary experience of being born at this time. And you're an indigo, I feel, so you were here to iconoclastically move gently and graciously in the face of establishment and saying, is that entirely just? Was that entirely correct? And then bring forth the wonder of what spirit is all about in 3D consciousness. And then, of course, you know, there was this extraordinary time when you went off grid. I mean, I'm leaping forward from 4 years of age, of course. How old were you when you decided that you would go off grid? And of course, to go off grid into the Atlas Mountains, the home of the Temple of Poseidon.
Yeah, I just want to rewind a little bit, and that the indigo children compassion stuff. I do, just to say, I do feel that throughout history, there have been hundreds of thousands of women and men who have a natural opening of their hearts and a natural sense of the need to grow and develop consciously and spiritually. And I don't think, one of the things we might discuss is this a special time? And one of the things you would hear me say is, I think all times are special. All times are special. But when those of us who are actually going through quite exciting changes ourselves, we tend to then project it out onto society as a whole. So yeah, these are exciting times, but they always have been exciting times, you know, just emerging out of a black hole and then passing through time to go into another black hole, you know, over those millions of years. That in itself is exciting, is it not? You know?
Absolutely. And you know, and of course, as we've shared in our pre-record conversation, the area of specialism that intrigues me most in my life for many, many years was the Elizabethan Golden Age, and I was steeped in it. And of course, this is before the machines, so it's actually technically before noise. And the noise that has defied us. And of course, that terrible event, I believe, at the beginning of the 17th century, when we all unplugged from the divine feminine, we desacralized nature because of the organization of what I call the thought police, meaning the scientists, the beginning of the age of enlightenment, where we were told that the earth was merely a lump of matter hurtling through space and it had no soul. Whereas up to that point, we had always believed in what was called then the anima mundi, the animating principle of the universe, the breath of life. You know, because they believed that God breathed on the surface of the waters and brought forth life. So if they felt weak or fatigued or debilitated, one of the great humors was to go into nature and to praise, petition, and participate, and they felt better. But then it all changed. There was, I don't know if I shared with you that one of the Lord Mayors of London in 1597 said that the wonder about going to the playhouse, of course I paraphrase, was that he could hear the human voice, and that all speech was decorated silence, which is different. We can't speak of that today.
Yes, I understand what you're saying. I don't have quite the same perspective, actually, because I think what you're talking about was the preserve of a few, and others were living in awful poverty, were uneducated. There was plague. And although the Enlightenment and the coming of the scientists, was a bad thing. It also meant that we were liberated from the Inquisition. We were liberated from the kind of stuff that still happens in some of the fundamentalist Arab countries, you know. So I'm kind of, yeah, Stewart, but there's a big silver lining in modernization, and people are fed. We live 60 years longer on average.
Yes,
women
that's
don't
not
die
really
in
what I was.
childbirth.
But, from a political point, a socio-political point, that's not really what I was talking about, because, of course, people were living in abject poverty,
yeah,
and often in abject misery. But really what I was talking about is that 2,500 people would pack themselves, sometimes 3,000 people would pack themselves into the Globe twice a day to hear the words of Shakespeare. And the words of Shakespeare, of course, were full of nature spirits, were full of spirit, were full of the divine feminine, were full. That's really what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
And of course, those people could not read. So when we don't read, we hear sound in a completely different way. We interpret our consciousness in a completely different way. But yes, of course, there were terrible things going on. But you could go to the Globe and just pay a penny and stand in the ground as groundlings, being part of the earth. But that was appreciated as a divine cosmology, because earth, water, air, and fire were very much part of that. However, we've gone off the point slightly, and this is me seducing you into all sorts of wonderful revelations about why the Atlas Mountains.
Intuition. It was an intuitive call. I'd been in Morocco when I was 17 years old, so I kind of knew it a little bit. I felt an affinity with the Berber peoples, and I feel very comfortable with Arab folk as well. And it was just a calling, and we found what had been a hunting lodge high up in the Atlas Mountains, completely off grid, and communed with spirit and the spirits. And it was a very deep experience for me. It took me maybe a decade to integrate. I remember coming back to London afterwards and being so shocked by the noise and the vibration of it. My flat was in South Kensington and near South Kensington, Gloucester Road Station, and it was just coming straight from you're talking about the Globe and Shakespeare's voice being in the silence of the landscape. I was 2 years in that silence up in the mountains, and to come back into the middle of a metropolis was very shaky. And it was because of that, actually, that I started developing the psychic protection work, because I myself was wobbling like crazy from all the vibes and was very sensitive to them. And so that particular book and all that stream of workshops came out of my own experience and what worked for me and seemed to help others. But London itself is a center of great energy, isn't it? With all the noise, there's huge, juicy creativity there.
What comes to my mind as you speak this is a testament to history in the form of being at St. James's, Piccadilly, for so many years as director of alternatives, and how that energy is so extraordinary. Wren's Church. How did you experience any psychic phenomenon whilst you were there?
Well, I was very aware of two things. One, that we were just blessed by being in a Christopher Wren temple, because the proportions and the coloring and the layout is sacred space. So there's an energy to it anyway. The other thing that I was aware of, and Sabrina, my partner, who was also part of the beginning of alternatives, and Malcolm Stone, who was absolutely instrumental in it all beginning, was that the most important thing to me was I knew that we were bringing new spirituality, thought forms and energies right into the heart of the Anglican Church of England community. And we were not a satellite to the church. We were a ministry of the church itself, because the vicar at the time was an extravagant host. He just liked having noise and parties around him. He wasn't actually into what we were doing in particular. It was just like, this will make a good thing for St. James's. But the sense was that we were planting a seed into the Anglican community, the Christian community. And those of us who were apparently not church people were, of course, privately deeply surrendered to Christ, deeply surrendered to unconditional love, deeply surrendered to the beauty of the story of Jesus and of Mary. Yet we were not church people. So there was an interesting little marrying of stuff there. And the most interesting psychic phenomena that Sabrina and I used to notice there was that every time we had a visiting representative of another spiritual tradition, you know, a shaman from some particular tribe, a Sufi teacher from a particular Sufi tradition, a Kabbalistic teacher, 2 or 3 days before they would actually come to speak in the church, the spirits of their tradition would come as an advance party and land in the church. So most of the talks were on Monday night. So come Friday, we'd be in the office there and we'd have a, well, look, something's turning up. What is it? What have we got on Monday? That something's just turning up. And we'd pause and go, oh, it's some of the spirits and angels of that particular Sufi tradition. And then the teacher would come in, sometimes quite innocent, like an ordained priest. They don't know that they've got angels with them, right? They'd come in, they'd be in the green room with us, having a ciggy, being neurotic, or being nervy or pompous, or whatever it was they were, right? And then they'd go out on the stage, out onto the altar platform, and then they'd say a few words that called in their spirits, and suddenly the space was completely transported into another atmosphere. And the audience would just go, oh, wow, this is extraordinary. And the frustrating thing in that moment was always that the audience would have the experience and go that the teacher was responsible for it. And Sabrina and I were sitting there going, they're feeling the spirits of the tradition. Right? They're not understanding that the person is just a conduit for it, just an anchor for it. And we used to love that. I used to love that. I was saying to you earlier, I used to go to all the talks, no matter how much I wasn't interested in the topic, because I was always interested in the atmosphere that would come through that particular teacher.
Yeah. And as we were reminiscing earlier, you know, during that time, I always felt that something very special was taking place within the communion of the energies that you speak of, and what was being transmitted into the space, which of course, as we know, there was so much heart consciousness. So the radiation must have gone on for many, 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 many miles off into the quality of the United Kingdom. And you know, so I remember feeling, because I sharing with you earlier, so much psychic phenomenon came to me as a child being there, you know. I mean, that was the place where I was introduced to Christianity, or discovered the ritualized form of religiosity, you know. It's where I was confirmed, where my brother was married to his first wife, and where both of my parents were memorialized. And so it holds great tender faith for me as being an extraordinary repository for all things spiritual, and particularly as there's a sacred well deep in the earth. You know, because Wren was so fascinated by geomancy, and so he employed this geomancy, both St. Paul's, and he considered St. James's as being his favored chamber for the acoustic.
Yes.
It's very interesting, and yet it's a very challenging acoustic, isn't it? Because it has such a reverb.
I'm not a master of that art, Stuart. But I notice you've got the William Blake picture behind your left shoulder, who was also a creature of St. James's.
He was. This is where I was at the age of 6. I became aware of William Blake walking up and down. I think I was sharing with you. And his poetry, of course, has been a constant inspiration to me.
Yeah.
Throughout the years, and so I have so many of his works. I would love to say they're the originals, but they're not. They're hanging in famous museums. Yes. And for those of you who don't know, William Blake was the grandfather of Romanticism.
I think people would also be interested in something else we were talking about earlier, because I was curious about how your mother, had responded to you at 6 years old, seeing Blake walking through the church. And you said something that touched my heart, which was that she was supportive and a protector of you. And that your dad was also supportive of that aspect of yourself.
Oh, no, he was not in support.
He was not.
Yeah.
So who was the one who was the...
Oh, Grandpa.
Your grandfather.
My grandfather, in other words, Mum's dad, you know, the Norfolk farmer.
Yeah.
He was extraordinary. Yes, I remember I was about 10 when he died, and he came to me. I was in St. Thomas's Hospital having a tonsillectomy, and he came to me in the middle of the night and said, "I'm going." Yes, he was. They realized that they had an unusual child, and because the 3D world found great contention in relation to me, because I just simply couldn't. It was post-war, you know what it was like. Academia was, well, not academia, but education was such a fervent force. And I just didn't fit in. I couldn't read. What I was doing synesthetically is seeing sound, you see. So I was floating on waves of sound. So when it came to the printed word and speech, the staccato nature of it dismayed me. And when I was about 9.5, 10, my mother had the ingenuity, because I was always humming. I silenced myself for 2 years. I self-muted for 2 years, and my brother spoke for me. So we had a code, he and I. He's a year older. And then Mum had this extraordinary ingenuity of, let's put Stewart into a church choir. And that's why I learned to read, because I learned through flow, sustained breath.
But did your grandfather take you out to?
He took me into the fields, yeah, because he was an extraordinary arable farmer in Norfolk on the Sandringham estate, and he had about 20 men who adored him, who worked for him, and these huge dray horses. I always remember being initially terrified, and then he put me on top of one once, and he could whisper them. I mean, he was just extraordinary, man. So he'd pick me up at 4 o'clock in the morning and put me on his shoulders and carry me off into the fields and show me the fairy rings. And you know that moment in Lord of the Rings where Gandalf whistles, this extraordinary whistle, and Shadowfax comes galloping across the meadow? That's what Grandpa would do. His name was John Barker. He would whistle, and these horses would come from nowhere, and their heads would go over his shoulders. And he had this special tongue that he used, this horse tongue. It was not English. It was something. And I remember standing in awe, and then he would just look at me and wink. So there was always this reassurance, very few words, but lots of tactile content.
I'm jealous that you had a grandfather like that. It's very beautiful, because I was brought up in a family of intellectuals, atheists. So from the age of 5, when I was having my own experiences, I kept quiet, because if I talked about them with my parents, the response I got was, "Yeah, of course, dear. It's just your imagination, you know." And my dad was a psychiatrist, and my mum was a psychologist, journalist. So they were both, and they both come out of the war as well, 3 years in a prisoner of war camp. So they were quite frozen and traumatized. But the benefit of all that for me was that in my head, I always had a dialogue going as to how am I going to best explain my experience to people who don't have these experiences. And I think that served me well. So there was a silver lining to the solitude of my mysticism, my psychism. Sabrina, my partner, was lucky because she had a mother and a grandmother who were also psychics in their own type, and so she could talk about it when she was young. It was normal for her.
And you were alone, were you?
I had an older sister.
You had an older sister.
I had an older
sister. She was
similarly
similarly intellectual.
No, she had a hearing disability. She was profoundly deaf because of deficiencies in my mother from the time in the prisoner of war camp. And so I was actually, I think that was part of my instinctive heart opening, because from early on I needed to be, to a degree, protective of her.
Mm.
And again, that's not a silver lining for her, but was a silver lining for me. But I think it's good for children, people, to be protective of the vulnerable.
Indeed.
I think that's a good instinct.
Indeed. And that's certainly something that's gone on all your life, in the sense of celebrating the vulnerable or the unjust or the dispossessed.
Yes, at a certain level. In my personal and private psychological life, I'm as messed up as anybody else, and I get it wrong, and I have my little tantrums and self-pitying moments, the stuff that everybody has, you know. So I'm not trying to put myself up on any kind of pedestal here, but I think there are whole hundreds and millions of us who do try to act from our hearts and from compassion. A lot of those folk are in the caring professions. A lot of those folk are unrecognized, uncelebrated, unvalidated, you know. But I don't think it's unusual.
Indeed, indeed. And a lot of people listening in, I know, are going to be very cherished by that. And
yeah, I hope so.
Moved by that. You're one of the first speakers that I've had on this series of deep dialogues that's addressed it in such a way. Well, therefore, reflecting on this time of unique global phenomenon, meaning COVID-19, economic uncertainty, political regimes quaking, can you offer us anything about how we steer our way through those people that are particularly sensitive or empathic?
Yeah, this is a very deep, complex subject, isn't it? I can only say how I approach it.
Please do.
And then that's the beginning of a conversation, because I don't necessarily want anybody to go, oh, I'm going to believe what he believes, or this is the beginning of a conversation. So the beginning of my conversation about all of this is I put COVID into an historical perspective, knowing that over the thousands of years of humanity's history, there have been many previous plagues. There's an interrelationship between our biological bodies and the zoological, botanical environment we're part of. And sometimes there's a crossover of germs, infections, and that's just what happens to humanity as a whole. It's just what happens. There've been plagues. This current plague was expected by medicine in general. They knew that sooner or later another plague would come, because they do come. We've been lucky in not having one for a while. At one point, do you remember a few years ago, people were paranoid about bird flu, and that didn't come. And now it has come, and it's a normal occurrence in human history. It will shake us up, and we'll pass through it. And there will have been some changes, and there will have been no changes. You know, things will shift a bit. For some of us who do conscious personal development, spiritual development, there'll be big shifts, because we'll use this as an opportunity for growth. For others who, for one reason or another, have a history of trauma and oppression, and maybe even torture or imprisonment, this life or past lives, the memory, the unconscious memories of those traumas and oppressive situations will feed into what looks like government trying to manipulate us. And those people will be particularly sensitive to government trying to control us. Now, at one level, I'm with them, because I think we should always be suspicious of government and how it controls us. I think we should always be suspicious of science and how it rolls out. At the same time, historically, smallpox, was eradicated more or less. Polio was eradicated more or less. And when there are situations of crisis, we have to behave as a group. And so I'm sympathetic to those folk who are absolutely certain that the government is part of a conspiracy. I'm sympathetic to those folk who think that it's all a conspiracy to introduce a certain type of vaccine to us, which will be the Trojan horse for some sinister control mechanism. I'm sympathetic to why they should think and feel that. And caution is always appropriate. But the crisis is real for me. And I think we need to behave appropriately and understand it in the perspective of this is just another plague and we need to do the best we possibly can. And it's early days. We need to do the best we possibly can to avoid more people dying and suffering. It's a complex subject.
Immensely complex. And throughout the period, I've been involved with medics. I have two medics who are clients of mine who have been with me for many, many years. I mean, they come for intuitive work. And they both reached out to me. They're both consultant virologists. How synchronous could that be? And leading great teams in London hospitals. So they both reached out and said, we need you to shadow us. And like, well, what does that mean? So they described, we want you behind us, help support. We need life force because the disease or the contagion is really one of fear rather than the physiological breakdowns, which of course are purely mechanistic. And we need to be there and be as compassionate as possible in our diagnoses. But actually the welter, the entire wave of fear is so gross. And I went in and I met it, and it was. And of course, as we know, when human fear becomes hysterical as a social phenomenon, many, many presences are released.
Yeah.
And so, I found myself speaking of, working for, and on one or two occasions demanding energetic boundaries because people, particularly the health workers, are just so extraordinary in their indefatigability of being there to serve extreme situations. There were so many people dying on us, and several people dying, and then I'm saying, no, I think we need to use the pads, bring them back. And they would come back and have extraordinary stories about where they've been. I'm working with one gentleman now who's absolutely amazing, 84 years of who's been a laborer most of his life and chain smoked. And he died, but then he came back and said, why do you bring me back? It's wonderful. Anyway, many stories about that.
Yeah. There's something more I'd like to say about that whole area. For people who get caught up in the fear, one of the criteria that I use for assessing whether the fear and anxiety someone's experiencing is genuinely theirs or whether they've been sucked into the cloud of humanity's fear, which is built up over millennia. It would have been around in the First and Second World Wars. It would have been around at the time of the Inquisition. It's there floating around the planet as a unpleasant energy field. I think if people, if they're reflective enough to notice, okay, I feel frightened, and that the moment that it tips into something that's slightly drama queening, slightly dramatic, slightly over the top, slightly hysterical, that at that moment when they're beginning to rant, they're not themselves anymore, they're channeling the collective fear. In benevolent situations, actors, you know this better than me, when they're doing sacred drama, there comes a certain moment where they're not just them acting, they're in a magnetic field where the archetypes and the energy of whatever it is they're portraying is working through them and playing back and forth with the audience, right? There's something magical happening. And they know they've entered into the state of sacred drama. And it's the same with energy work. When people are unconsciously channeling a particular field of energy. You can assess it by the precise moment they move from, okay, that's reasonably personal, to, hello, we've gone into a bit of drama now. You're channeling something that's not yours. The challenge, of course, is that I have several friends who have gone into the drama of the paranoia. And the problem is that when they're in that drama, they're so caught up in it that it's very difficult to calm and center them. I had one friend do it last week, and he was just, and I just looked at him. I held my center. The most difficult thing was for me to hold my center because I could feel his attack energy. And I just went calmly. I said, I don't agree. And I said again about a minute later, I don't agree with you. And he went, and I said, I don't agree with you. Why are you still talking at me? I don't agree with you. And he kind of paused and went, I want to talk. I said, that's fine. But hey, normally we have conversations where I say something and you say something, and we inquire about the issue. I don't have you suddenly hitting me with a bad vibe and lecturing me. And he came back a few hours later to me and said, got it, understand. That he'd been caught up in the collective dark energy.
Yeah.
And we know where that can go in relation to Auschwitz or the killing fields or the Inquisition. People need to be careful.
So I hear great skills coming through your wonderful oration, because you tell the story so well. One is detach, feel stillness, and observe, rather than bound forward and become contaminated by collective force. And the second being, we need to keep purifying our emotional intelligence through meditation, because through meditation we can find stillness. And in the panic, there is no stillness. So we react rather than responding.
Yes. And
there's always and.
Yeah, I want to add something to it, which is, I think it's probably less highfalutin and noble than that. I think it's actually, if I reframed this person, as someone who was suffering, that took me into a space of feeling compassion and love for him. And feeling compassion and love for him, I was able then to center down into my body and chill out. So it was a mixture of, use your breath, William. Anchor down into the earth, William. Love him. This is suffering. It was a mixture of all of that. And
yes, but wouldn't you agree? Firstly, we need to love ourselves, and that's the energy boundary that I was trying to delineate. That we detach, feel stillness, observe, and then we can feel divine ministry working through us that brings us to unconditional love and compassion. But we have to, otherwise we get caught up in the fear. And the fear, as we know, in the Course in Miracles, it says that fear is an hallucination, all there is love. But it's difficult when our adrenals and cortisol are pumping those energies. Yeah. So that's what I was really meaning.
I absolutely buy that. Absolutely buy that for me and for you. But, I have spent a lot of time working with and training nurses and care assistants who, by and large, do not love themselves, but by and large have a calling in their hearts to care. And in crisis situations and with people who are ill and dying, they instinctively center, embody, and care. And they don't love themselves. In fact, the trainings I always did with them was, can you just learn to care for yourself a bit more? I tell you, ultimately, in all those trainings, I came out of them wanting to be a shop steward and give them higher wages and better working conditions, in actual fact. Right?
Sure.
So I've learned from being with them as their coach and tutor, I've learned something very deep for myself, which is just to cut through all my bullshit and just love. when I can. When I'm not caught up, just get on with it. Just get on with it, you know. And there are millions of people who do that, aren't there? You know.
Indeed. And you know, and the way you tell it is an extraordinary example for us all, a witness, so we can measure our own lives. How much love do we have? And you see, I mean, I feel something extraordinary happens as you describe this, that they become a vessel of love. So whether there's a self-regard that we call self-love or not, they become a vessel of love. Otherwise, we've all been in those situations where we've been administered to by someone who is a nurse or a doctor in deep care. And we've all been in those situations where we looked into the eyes of the person. Probably we haven't been able to look into their eyes because they don't look at us and they don't show care. So somehow the people that you're speaking of, I feel, they move into a ministry of love. So they literally embody love, whether they regard themselves or not. They have that extraordinary ability, which is why they're there. I mean, this is true caritas, isn't it? It's true charity.
Yeah. I also think that Gaia, or evolution, has been quite shrewd here, because I think there's a mammalian instinct to care for that which is vulnerable. Actually, there's equally other instincts that are a lot more horrible. But I've met and worked with some very, very with criminals in prison, and we know that strange irony of there's the criminal in prison. God knows what they've done, and yet, if they find a little bird that's injured, they'll hold it in their cradled hands and care for it. Right? There's a huge paradox there. So I think if human beings are, this is me hopeful. This is me saying something hopeful. If people are brought up properly as children, if they're not too damaged, that instinct to care is just there. I mean, it's the instinct that parents have, that best friends have, that coaches, good people have. It's a basic instinct, and I think human beings can be very good at it, actually, and they don't have to be saints. I don't like woke folk who kind of have this notion that there's a kind of saintly purity in being loving. You know, I think it's built into us. There, that's a mini rant I have.
It was tiny.
Yes.
So we're really talking about the redeeming nature of the human spirit, that even though sometimes our choices, unconscious or conscious, move us into perilous activities, that there is always a redeeming. I mean, some of the most moving occasions that I had years and years and years ago when I was with the Royal Shakespeare Company in the 70s, Cicely Berry, who was the voice director, was known for going into Broadmoor, you know, which was maximum security, where we take Shakespeare, and I would go with her, and there would be these serial murderers that were often psychically very disturbed, and to see them smile or weep when they heard the words of Shakespeare, even though some of them didn't quite understand the literary, that they were aware of the magic because of the way that we were able to embody the magic. So their right brains were activated. And then when I was at the Globe for all those years, I worked with the governor of Brixton Prison, and I went in and did voice workshops with, and they were petty criminals. I mean, this was all arson, embezzlement, GBH, drugs.
What did they think of your posh accent?
They loved me. They absolutely loved me. You see, when I'm in those situations, you know, I've worked in different industries, like the hairdressing industry. Nobody finds me highfalutin. They never ever talk about my social background, or, you know, and because I'm an actor, so I'm a third-class citizen who speak in a certain way, because I happen to be a leading voice coach who has received pronunciation over the years. But no, never ever has it been a social displacement. But I guess that's also to do with the way that I carry myself. Although I have a certain command and people say presence, but actually I meet people in a totally authentic way. And humor and grace are constant companions for me. I remember when during our pre-record conversation, we were talking about COVID and conspiracy theory and so forth, which we've touched on. And you mentioned that you'd had this extraordinary dream about Britannia.
Ah,
Do you feel liberated enough to share it with us?
Yes, well, I wrote about it. We were talking about Brexit, actually. We were talking about politics in general and all the shifts that have been going on over the last decade. And you asked me where I had been on Brexit, and I said I had campaigned to remain, to stay in the European Union, and had posters up outside and was prepared to have conversations with people about it because I felt European. Londoner, European, Gladstonian. That's, for people who don't know, I live in Glastonbury. Avalonian. I live in the Vale of Avalon.
Also, of course, I forgot to mention you're a trustee of the Abbey, Glastonbury Abbey.
Trustee of Glastonbury Abbey.
Amazing. Forgive me, I forgot that at the end of my your bio.
Yes, that's an archetypal role, isn't it? So when the vote came in around Brexit and we'd lost, like everybody else, I was shocked and upset. But I don't get upset for very long. So about half an hour later, I'd kind of brushed it off and went, well, there's the sweep of history going. We lost that one. You know, who knows what's going to happen at the next one. And then 2 nights later, I had a dream, which completely turned me around. And in this dream, I met this being. And this being said, I am Britannia, the angel of these isles. And I'm really happy about this vote because there was too much of a mashup going on with all the nations. We were getting mashed together, and we all have our own distinct style and culture and individuality. And I needed some room to breathe. So this is just fine. Thank you very much. Looking at me, kind of get over it, you know. And I woke up that morning with a completely different perspective on it. Published a piece about it. 90% of the response was interesting insight, thank you, that helps me. 10% was, how can you possibly support an idea as horrible as Britannia because she ruled over the empire, enslaving and colonizing the world, you know, which is an interesting perspective. Anyway,
yes, but
yes,
it's distorted. It wasn't Britannia. It was men and some women who did
it. Yeah. But it was people. I like hearing people's ideas.
But it's distorted.
Yes. But on
inaccurate.
But on the other hand, we could have a whole conversation about.
I'd love to read the article
about the white man's burden. Right. and the distortion.
You know, which is why I wanted you to tell the story. What I feel is this beautiful largesse that arises, this wonderful, wonderful love that arises from the great, enormous archetypal energy of Britannia. This wonderful, wonderful love. And, you know, it reminds me of so many occasions when I felt myself at odds, because I'm an indigo, so I have Saturn diametrically opposed to my sun in Taurus, which means that daddy was a problem and my bosses have been a problem and establishment has been a problem, in the sense of the fact that I upset by always trying to deduce truth and parity and point out injustice and so forth. That there's this wonderful feeling whenever one moves into a deep healing situation, often by surrendering to a competent other in the form of a hypnotherapist or a psychotherapist. And going through your 3 years with Dr. Glover must have been extraordinary. That we drop into this divine archetypal space where, for me, Divine Mother comes forth and says, it doesn't matter. Whereas the ego has been chomping on the bit and trying to achieve some form of, but I must speak my truth or bring about change. And on that subject, because we're living in a time of immense change, How do you feel about change?
I'm on a spectrum. At one end of the spectrum, I have a little motto, which is each breath, new patterns. Each breath, new patterns. The other end of the spectrum, I've got a mixture of stuff, but it's, I'm not going to change. I'm stuck and I like it. So I've got me and I've got humanity on this spectrum, right? But I know, as do you, that ultimately this particular cosmos gets sucked back into a black hole. One thing I know. The other thing I know from experience, not belief, is that the universe is suffused with love and consciousness. So even if the solid stuff melts away, love and consciousness continues. So the only change I'm really interested in is witnessing the struggle and the redemption and the resurrection and the emergence of more love, more consciousness. I like people. I like working with groups of people. I like hanging out with people who are in the business of developing love and consciousness, love and wisdom. I prefer that. For me is, some people like gardening. I like being in relationship with people who are growing. I find that so change is inevitable. Change is inevitable, and I just wish people would recognize that the change that's actually inevitable is more love, more consciousness, and just get off the fear and the status and the money and all the rest of it, which is very attractive and glamorous and seductive, but it's meaningless. That's where I end up always. I'm a good meditator. So quite often, as a good boy meditating, I go, let's just pretend I don't believe anything. That everything I've ever learned, everything I've learned from all those fantastic esoteric books and sacred texts and all the wonderful teachers I love and everything I've picked up psychically and intuitively in meditation and believe, supposing all of that is just a great big delusion. Just let it go, let it go, let it go. What do I actually feel and experience? And deep in my core, I go, oh, it's all about love and consciousness. More kindness, more care, more compassion, but with consciousness, with witnessing, with mindfulness. Yeah. So that's where I sit as that's my fundamentalist position, love and consciousness.
Well, it's beautiful in terms of the whole tenor of our conversation, because we've always gone full circle to you as a 4-year-old child in that square in Earl's Court, being aware of the beauty of nature and the way that you addressed it an hour ago. This deep, deep, deep knowing that love is all there is. How do you know that knowing?
Well, number one, I accept that there is a lot of suffering on this planet, and I accept that there are forces of negativity and destruction and stupidity and ignorance and cruelty and psychopathy, sociopathy, just mad cruelty. I accept all that. I'm never going to deny all that. And yet, consistently through spiritual practices, day by day by day by day by day, I experience in my very depth of my body and my soul and my heart and my consciousness that I live in this field of this ocean of energy. It's a mystery to me what it actually is. Complete mystery. I have no idea how it all started and where it all goes. But there is love and benevolence in it, and that's actually like a endless wave seeking to fully incarnate and express itself. And I'm an iconoclast like you. I don't like authority. I don't like hierarchy. I don't like status. I don't like fixed ideas. So I'm continually prepared to deconstruct that proposition. I'm continually prepared to say, well, there may be other dimensions where it's pure evil. Right? I don't know, right? But in this dimension where we live, here and now, in this cosmos, my daily experience through spiritual, and I teach it to people. I teach people how to have that experience. And so from a scientific perspective, if you can repeat a behavior and get a similar result, you're onto something. And if people do spiritual practice of whatever it is that particularly works for them, they will experience the bliss and ecstasy of the mystery of it all. And I say this is not to deny the cruelty and the suffering. It's just to put it in perspective.
So many wonderful thoughts. There are a number of people lots of people who have tuned in, and I just wanted to open up the platform to them if they have any questions to ask. You know, there are wonderful people who are literally reminiscing on all that you're speaking about and finding their own relativities and celebrating it. So appreciate William's balanced view of the fact of COVID, etc. So interesting to look at the balanced complexities. Hey, you're a polemicist. Well done, William. And Barbara, any questions, anybody? I'm scrolling through. Wonderful sacred space, energy parallels. Beautiful, beautiful. Gosh, so many people speaking, but writing in very long sentences. So sorry for folks, I can't go through everything. Any questions, anybody? Oh, how to know about knowing, how to know about the knowing surely has a tradition in spiritual practice passed down from one generation to the next through spiritual conversation and shared practice. This is Barbara, dear Barbara. Anything to comment on?
I don't think I fully understand the question.
When we were talking about how do you know about knowing, it's how to know about the knowing surely has a tradition in spiritual practice being passed down from one generation to the next.
Yes, agreed. And we're continually, each of us individually, privately, is continually reinventing how we explore spirituality. Yes, many of us may do meditation, but in the privacy, for example, of sitting, everybody's having a unique experience of themselves, their consciousness, and their witnessing of what and feeling of what's happening. Mm. And everybody who does ceremony, for example, which may be passed down, the individual is having an experience which is unique unto them. So I sometimes think of people who are cynical or judgmental of people who still go to church, you know. And there you have an English church full of people in rows, regimented rows, and then they're singing together or praying together. And what you don't know is what's happening inside each of those individuals privately. And inside each of those individuals, there's something happening that's useful and different. And that's why they're there. And it may be they're getting comfort from the collective, in which case there's a form of healing, psychological healing. It may be that the words of this hymn are triggering thoughts, or it may be that the beauty of the ceremony, there's something's happening for everybody individually. So yes, stuff is passed down from master to student, teacher to teacher, priestess to priestess. But the reality is each of us has our own unique experience of it. And I think when we pass a practice or a spiritual practice on to someone else, I think the real thing we're passing on to them is, hey, look, I'm discovering cosmic love. Why don't you have a go as well? Mm. You know, that's the essence of what's actually happening. And I do it this way. Here, do you want to try my way? Go on, try my way, you know. And yeah.
That's fascinating. I've always had the ability, as I think you do as well, of seeing aura. Mm. And the aura always told me what the quality of vibration was in terms of, is this person in integrity or not? Maya Angelou said to me once, when somebody tells you their truth, believe them, which is a wonderful double-edged sword.
I'm so envious of you that you met her.
I'm envious of me meeting her.
Yeah.
I had 3 hours with her.
Okay.
The most extraordinary, one of the most extraordinary experiences of my life.
I love that.
There was authenticity for you.
So if we're going to drop names, I had a whole relationship with James Baldwin.
Oh, really?
Whole friendship with him, which was equally, completely,
absolutely,
deeply touched me.
And of course, they were very good friends in the 60s through Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So Lisa is asking the changes that at this time are evidently, excuse me, don't move. What do you feel about the direction that we're moving in? What direction should we take? Well, I know you're going to say that's up to the individual, but this is the first major reset that we've had since, for example, because of the global crisis, since, for example, the World War. Is there anything? This is from a mature lady.
I think there's some big socio-cultural political things that are germinating. One of them is the possibility of a hugely increased partnership between schools and parents. What we've shifted over the last 100 years to this kind of parents just shunting the children off to school as if they're nothing to do with the education. And what's happened through COVID is parents have had to engage. And I would love to see that. So the homeschooling crowd, somehow or other, that whole ethos integrating more fully with mainstream education. There's also something happening in education, for example, like there's a load of students who've traveled hundreds of miles to go to uni, and now they're there in their digs and all the lessons are online. So there's something in the future about education being digital, but there being localized circles of students working together because they happen to live geographically closer. And there's something to do about the workspace. Well, those of us who've been into social change, looking at a city like London or Mexico City or Buenos Aires or Sao Paulo or wherever it is, what we know works is villages within the city. So what I would love for London is every 300 yards, there's a green space with a play area and community buildings and schools hub around these local centers rather than you busing children to schools where they're more middle-class parents. So, so there's something moving in that direction because the growth of cities as we know it it's kind of recent, and technology as we know it is really recent, isn't it? 25 years. And those of us I'm going on a bit, but those of us who've been doing Zoom and digital stuff, we've realized, having got over our technophobia and I don't like computers and I don't like all that kind of stuff. We've realized, I love it actually. We've realized that it's a really useful way of working. And one of the wonderful things that can happen is, although there are people listening to this right now on the west coast of the United States, just as there are in Scotland or wherever, we could pause for 5 seconds now and go into silence and feel a connection between us.
Yeah.
And there's something about the web-based work, which has made the etheric, telepathic connection stronger. Yeah. So there's something cooking there that's interesting. And I remember when I did my book on fairies and angels, and somebody went to buy a digital version of it rather than the paperback version, and somebody said, "Oh, what the angels won't like that." They might. And I found myself saying, well, which do you think angels and fairies are going to prefer? They're going to prefer stuff that's from cut down trees or from electric dancing molecules in the air, right? In light and electricity. What are they going to prefer? What's more elemental? Right? So there's interesting stuff cooking there for us to share.
I want to honor this. I mean, I'm honoring everybody because you're all writing extraordinary things, but there's a lady that's come through by the name of Avril Price, who I know very well, who's an amazing,
Avril.
you know, Avril, she's come through, and this wonderful, wonderful lady of the tarot, and is a great, great tarot reader and psychic and teacher. Wonderful conversation. Whoops, more love, more consciousness. What are your thoughts about getting this idea out more fully into the everyday mainstream so it has a more practical application? Great question, Avril.
We each need to do our little bit. My little bit has been that we developed the first mainstream qualification on the Ofqual, which is the government register, called Practical Spirituality and Wellness. So I've tried to, it's been a piece of work, the admin and the bureaucracy to get the kind of stuff we're talking about here into a package that can go through the due diligence process to be on to be a government accepted qualification. So that's my little bit of it. And I
well
think,
done. Wow. Because I know that the protocols of administration. So really we're talking about be the change you want to see in the face of the collective bewilderment.
Yeah, I think it's, number one rule, don't be precious about it.
What do you mean?
When you're speaking to ordinary people about this stuff, don't use precious language or precious.
Who do you think's using precious language?
Loads of New Agers and spiritual folk. Don't be precious about
it. Can you describe what you mean by being precious?
Well, I can describe the opposite. The opposite is us lot. This is a direct answer to Avril, right? We should be able to go to a pub or a bar and somebody says, what are you into? And you could be able to say, I'm into spirituality. And you know that's going to trigger some response, right? And they go, what do you mean by that? They're going to say sarcastically or aggressively. And I would say, I'm into connecting with the wonder and energy of life and having that guide me a bit. And I'm into a bit of love and consciousness so we behave better. Like get it very grounded and solid and be able to speak it as a common sense truth. And if you put it like that in a pub, somebody's going to say, well, I can't, yeah, that's interesting. Tell me a bit more. And I would then go, well, when do you feel the wonder and energy of life? You know, when your team scores, you know, when your children pass exams, what's going on? What's going on for you? When do you feel it? And don't you have an instinct to be more caring, you know? Just start the conversation. Start the conversation and keep it real. Keep it real. And don't go off and kind of veganism, purity, meditation, you know, just keep it real and grounded. That's what I would like to see. I would like to see us living in a world where connecting with the wonder and energy of life and guiding oneself to be more loving and more conscious is as normal a part of everyday conversation as 5 veg and fruit in your diet or exercise. It's just a normal part of conversation.
My experience in my childhood was that it was in certain situations, particularly when there was that extraordinary vibration, often at Christmas time. In other words, when the collective of the family got together and things were stirring and people would tell unusual stories of what we would call as being the paranormal. In other words, people would talk about ghosts and so forth. And then there was permissibility to talk about so much. Maybe that's a way of seducing. But yes, when in Rome, do as the Romans. Hey, we've gone way past our time. So I'm unfortunately, as your chairkeeper, I'm going to have to bring us to a close. So thank you, everybody. William, stay where you are. Don't go. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. And I know, well, there he is. He's waving to you all. Bless you, bless you. And thank you for all of your wonderful statements. I look forward to seeing you next week when I have a conversation with Emmanuel Daga, who is very extraordinary, living in Los Angeles, but was formerly born and bred in the Lebanon. Au revoir, everybody. Thank you for tuning in.